Who Gets to Decide? A liberty-based podcast that brings a little piece of sanity to a confused society drowning in a culture of craziness. And here is your host, Seth Martin.
Well, all right. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Who Gets to Decide. This is episode 652. I'm Seth Martin, your host. Thank you for joining me this evening. Glad you're here and always happy you're listening. Well, it's been a little while since I've made another show. Just stuff going on. Hopefully you guys don't care too much, that you're patient and waiting for the next show to come out. I'm trying to do at least a couple a week, but it just depends on what we're doing. I went to Wimberley, Texas last weekend, and that's a great place to go if you've never been. I highly recommend it. It's in the Texas Hill Country. And the weather was great, except for one day it rained. And we had a great time. We tooled around Wimberley. Some friends of ours have a house out there. And it was kind of interesting. They bought, they don't get a lot of rain out there. And so everybody has well water. And they're at like 1,250 feet above sea level. So they're not ever going to flood out there or anything like that. But they just don't get that much rain. And they were kind of worried about their well. And they bought this 18,000 gallon tank to collect water off the roof, and then it gets filtered and all that stuff, and then they can drink it or use it to bathe and stuff like that. And 1 inch of rain will produce off the roof 1,800 gallons of fresh water, which I thought was really cool. So the guy out there that he put all that in, he showed me how all that worked. It was really interesting. Had a good time looking at all that, kind of geeked out over that. And anyway, just nice to get away and spend some time away from Houston, the metropolis of Houston, which is 4+ million people, lots of traffic and impatient drivers and things like that. So today what I wanted to do is kind of in the context of the war, but I wanted to specifically, you guys know me on here. I mean, I talk about the economic aspect of things, and I think sorry, I get something in my eye. I think the war, the longer it drags out, is going to be very economically damaging to the United States. And there's an interview that I found that I thought was pretty good in explaining some of this, and I wanted to use that as a basis to discuss today. And I just think Americans have underestimated how interconnected we are around the world and how much we depend on very complicated supply chains. I mean, this is the good news and the bad news is this is part of what makes your standard of living better, right? This is what makes our lives better, that we have a very complicated supply chain and we're so integrated, and the division of labor is so complicated. It makes our life better, right? It makes it increases overall production, and it essentially makes everybody's life better. The flip side of that is you can't have crazy governments starting wars and screwing all that up. Now, some of you might be saying, "Oh, Seth, come on. You're being a little bit hyperbolic. We're not having anything like that." Yeah, oil prices, gas prices at the pump are a little bit higher. But we're not having, our standard of living is not dropping significantly or anything like that. And what I would just say to you about that is just wait and see. I mean, you should be rooting for Trump to finish this thing very quickly, if he can. We've talked about that before, that there's two elements. There's 3 other countries involved in this conflict, and one of them is Iran. And I think Iran was probably happy to negotiate and do something diplomatic. But now that we've hit the button and started launching bombs, they're essentially not really in the mood to negotiate too much. Certainly not with the conditions that we were placing on them at the beginning, right? And so strategically, I think maybe Trump thought that he could just kill 30 or so people at the top of the regime, and then this would all just be over. And whoever's advising him in the White House way underestimated Iran, I would say. And then the other element is you got Iran, you got Israel. And Israel this is all going just perfectly for Israel. Israel doesn't care if Iran is chaotic or anything like that. They want to basically be in a position where they can extend their greater Israel project. And so, even if Trump wants to stop, and even if Iran wants to stop, you still got this situation where Israel could just keep launching bombs, just keep after it and keep it going. And I think this is a real problem, and it's going to start causing a lot of problems in the global economy. And that's what I want to talk about today. So we've got a couple of clips from some people that I actually introduced to you a couple of weeks ago, except today, this guy, Luke Gromen, he's on Bob Murphy's show. Bob Murphy is an economist that I follow. He's very, very smart, and I just like the way he approaches things, and I just thought this was a good interview, and it'd be a good basis for having a discussion here on the show. All right, so there's Luke Gromen and Bob Murphy on the screen. Let me hit play, and this first thing they're going to talk about is, the kind of the way this was sold. So what I mean by that is, you had this kind of situation where it was like, hey, America, you're going to pay a little more at the pump for a while, but isn't that a great trade-off, to not have nuclear weapons? And this is kind of how they've been pitching it. And my point is, it's not just going to be for a little while. It's going to be for some extended period of time, because now that we're in this, I don't think Iran is not going to accept the parameters that we were putting forth before the bombs started to fly. I mean, they want a civilian nuclear program. They want security guarantees. They don't want to be bombed every 6 months. They want all the sanctions to go away. We covered all these in a couple of shows ago. And so, it's not as easy as just, okay, we'll stop punching you in the face, open up the Strait of Hormuz. You can't have a nuclear weapon. It's not that simple. All right, let's start here.
Bottlenecks, geez, I can think of one over there, Strait of Hormuz. I saw you did a show. Lynn Alden was also a guest with you. Can you just lay out, some, like, for example, just to give you a foil, right now, the line coming from many people who are pro the Trump administration and their stance on this is, hey, a lot of people are willing to pay high gas prices for a few extra weeks in order to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Give me a break. And so what are your thoughts on all this kind of stuff?
I would equate it to having your dentist say, here, you need a root canal. Take this shotgun, put it in your mouth, and pull the trigger, and that'll get rid of the root canal. That way I won't have to do a root canal. It's a very, very blunt instrument that will ultimately be fatal to the global economy, the U.S. economy, if it's allowed to transpire for too long. And that is simply because we are in a globalized world now. And you're in a globalized world, and supply chains are very, very long, and we're in a highly levered, globalized world. And when you're making something, any product, the reality is if you are missing one component of thousands, you can't make that product. And as it turns out, the combination of the stuff that comes out of Hormuz, be that oil and gas most obviously, but then things that are less obvious like sulfuric acid for refining all sorts of critical minerals that go into our nifty little devices here, fertilizer, which to feed the world. And then when you connect that to Southeast Asia, China in particular, when they start suffering any kind of shortages of those inputs, then this is a non-linear breakdown in supply chains. If there isn't enough helium in China or Taiwan, this doesn't just hit a couple things. This hits a factor of 100 things more, which then hits a factor of 100 things more. And so we quickly, we've been saying since this war started, A, that I think it's going to last a lot longer than people think. And B, we've got until about mid-April until supply chains start breaking down non-linearly. And so far on those two, I feel pretty good about both of those comments. It's lasted longer than most people thought 7 weeks ago. And right on cue, right around mid-April, we're starting to see much more acute breakdowns in supply chains. And so it's pretty alarming in terms of where things will go over the next month, 6 weeks. If Hormuz stays closed, as a result of these supply chain breakdowns. And again, even if they fixed it today, even if everything went back to normal today, there's again this sort of financial macro policymaker view. It was like, okay, well, we'll just, turn it off and turn it back on like we do our computers. And that's not how it works in the real world, in the physical world. There are physical constraints. There are things that have to come back up, that plants that take a while to be basically kind of restarted and re-warmed up. When you talk about things like aluminum, et cetera. So we're looking at very serious, very, very serious disruption, best case at this point. And every day that it stays mostly or entirely closed from here, it's a nonlinear worsening of the U.S. and of the global economy and the U.S. economy.
Okay. There's a whole lot there, but the thing I want to harp on or focus on or put emphasis on is the multiplier effect. Okay, so think about it like if you have, at the very front end of a production system, you have commodities. Like we talked a few weeks ago, we talked about iPencil and how nobody has all the knowledge to make a pencil. And, I kind of summarized that essay, right? I talked about how, if you look at the rubber is not something you can just walk around and pick up off the ground. It's something that has to be produced. And so you start with, some base material, and then that goes you add some chemicals, and there's some synthesis that takes place and some processing, and you get rubber, and then it goes through distribution, and it goes through all these different places, and, ends up in a pencil, right? Same thing with, the lead, which is actually graphite. You have to dig that out of the ground, and then you have to refine it, and so when you start with these commodity type products, like we've been talking about helium, and oil is obvious, and he mentions aluminum and certain chemicals and things like that. What happens is, as you move through the production process, the impact grows. Okay, it's like an exponential, it's a widening. Okay, so you start with one commodity at the bottom, and next thing you know, you've touched 1,000 industries or whatever. And so this is the part that your average person is just not getting. Okay, they don't understand. It's all oil, right? Oh, okay, so gas is going to be a little bit more expensive. Big deal, No, you could actually get to a point where you go to the store, and the things you want to buy at the store, or the things you want to buy at Amazon or Walmart or wherever you go, they're just not there anymore. Okay, it'd be very simple. I mean, the example we gave before is like, I think Lynn Alden brought this up, is like, let's say you're missing some sensor that goes in an airbag, but you can't sell the car. It's just missing that one part, and so the car's not for sale. The same thing happens with like Walmart. Walmart is not going to take delivery of certain products if the little motor inside is missing that is made somewhere in this complicated supply chain. It's the same kind of thing. And so these products like he says at some point here, Ford shuts down, and then but these are the big companies, Ford, but there's millions of companies that are small companies that are part of this integrated supply chain, and you just have no idea who they are. But they impact the ability of that product to make it to a shelf somewhere so that you can buy it. Now, maybe you're thinking this isn't a big deal, but this happens across all industries, like food. Chemicals go in all kinds of products that we use for, I'm just looking at stuff I'm wearing, my shirt, the microphone, some glasses, the remote for the TVs, the screens on the TVs, the circuit boards in the TV. It just goes on and on and on and on. And every time every time it widens out, it just impacts that much more of industry. It kind of goes back to, I say this a lot to people, is like, they'll say GDP is 75% or is the majority of the economy, or something like consumption is majority of the economy. That's what they say. It's 75% of GDP consumption. Well, that's because, generally speaking, as you produce something, The commodities are produced in huge quantities, but as you produce products and you go from commodities to finished product, things spin off and get more and more specific. And obviously, yeah, at the end where the final sale takes place, if you add all that up, yeah, okay, that's a big number for GDP. But without the things at the beginning, there is no GDP. That's the point. I mean, just rewind and start thinking, before, when I was a kid, there were no iPhones. And I mean, these are all things that have come about primarily because of the length of the supply chain and the complexity of our production processes. And to just think this is limited to oil is missing the forest for the trees. See, with the next subject, by the way, is, he talks about Scott Bessent saying, we're just going to have a war for 50 days, but it'll bring 50 years of stability. I mean, that's the saying in the Trump administration. And obviously, that's ridiculous, right? We're already seeing that that's not going to happen because now that we've started it, the Iranians are not willing to stop. They're not willing to just say, okay, we trust you not to bomb us anymore or to stay out of our business. No, they're trying to exact a price from the United States. And this is going to go on longer than 50 days. It's already gone on longer than 50 days. And so what you've got now is you've got Iran taking advantage of this aggression by the United States and Israel, and they're going to exact a price out of the United States. That's their goal at this point. And that price could be leave the Middle East. We want security guarantees. We want some sort of peace treaty with you. We're going to develop nuclear energy if we see fit. One of the things that's missing from all this, by the way, is the Iranians are signatories on the non-proliferation agreement, just like we are. And so we actually have a treaty that says they won't produce nuclear weapons. This whole rhetoric about Iran can't have a nuclear weapon is in a lot of ways a very hyperbolic, very propagandist kind of argument. They're already in agreement that they're not going to develop a nuclear weapon. But see, we've taken it further. I say we, Israel really is behind this. Israel is saying no enrichment at all, period. You can't enrich for civilian purposes. You can't enrich at all. And of course, that's like saying you can't produce oil. That's just, it's a form of energy that's safe and effective and efficient. And you're telling this country they can't use it. All right, so let's get into the 50 days for 50 years of stability argument. And this is a little bit crazy because it really makes no sense, but it just goes to show you how flippant and frivolous their arguments are to try to make the propaganda work.
Oh, that's exactly right. And there's this, hey, it's just a little bit of inflation. I think it was really telling. Yesterday, Scott Bessent came out, Treasury Secretary Bessent came out and said, hey, I think it's 50 or 100 or more days for 50 years of stability. And people said, oh, good. I said, no, wait a minute. Go back in time. March 22nd, same Secretary Bessent said 50 days for 50 years of stability. That was 23 days ago, sir. And there's not a single person that raised their hand in that audience and said, hey, 23 days ago, you said 50 days for 50. And here we are, 23 days of the 50 days later, we are no closer to having anything worked out. And now you're extending it. So now we're 73 to 123 days or more for 50 years of stability. What happens in the likelihood that at day 85, supply chains start breaking down really non-linearly? Oops. Taiwan hits constraints on LNG or on helium, or China is unable to produce components that Taiwan needs. So Taiwan's probably not going to be the first thing that breaks, but you just one component somewhere, boom, oops, Ford needs to shut down in Michigan because they can't get XYZ from, or, likelihood, hey, data center, ABC is not going to get built till 2030 now because guess who makes a lot of the components you need for it? China and Europe. So then they have to shut down because they can't get the energy they need. So there's this, I'm astonished by the complacency at the moment in markets and amongst policymakers. And I'm acutely aware that I think part of, at least from the policymakers side, that it is a very cynical complacency. In other words, they want the markets complacent, because if the bond market starts revolting or supply chains really start breaking down, they're going to have to, the U.S. is going to have to seek terms of peace in this conflict that are not necessarily what they were hoping for. It will cement a strategic loss for the United States in the Strait of Hormuz. So they're happy to keeping markets, to let markets be of the mind that, hey, everything is awesome, everything is fine, this isn't a problem. And they're actively encouraging that view. I think that view is totally wrong. I think we're a couple weeks from really starting to see that happen, but that's what makes markets.
Okay. Yeah. So anytime he's talking about nonlinear breaks, what he's talking about is the multiplier effect, right? He's talking about how a $200 billion industry could literally be crippled because, I don't know, a $2 part can't get in there or something. Same kind of deal, this little bitty business who nobody's ever heard of maybe, but it's some sort of critical component into something we don't even know. Like we're trying to give examples. This guy's trying to give examples. He's talking about Ford shutting down. But even Ford shutting down wouldn't be a disaster. But hundreds or thousands of businesses shutting down, especially that are in the consumer products or the grocery business, like the food business, this would be a disaster. Okay, you couldn't just flip a switch and get it all to start back up. That's the other part of the problem. The damage to these things is very significant, and these companies that are trying to respond to this, they could spend a lot of money doing that, redesigning parts, looking for new suppliers that are not on that side of the world, they're on this side of the world, and now the product has to go up in price, and maybe we don't get it for 6 months while they re-engineer it and reproduce it. So there's all kinds of, my whole thing is like the lack of humility in government just puts us all at a tremendous amount of risk. I mean, you got Trump over there. You could just imagine Trump saying, yeah, now you're right. We'll just launch some missiles over there and wipe out 30, 40, 50 people at the top of the regime, and then the Iranians can take over their country. I mean, would that let's explore that for just a second. Would that happen in America? If you somehow wiped out half the Senate, maybe the president, the vice president, and half the Senate, that's 40, 50, 60, 100 people. Would that be enough to overthrow America? I don't think so. You still got the Democrats and the Republicans, you got these institutions, they have the same kind of thing, okay? So it's just naive and reckless to think that, and then to act on it is even more reckless for us, for Americans. You've got basically the president of the United States playing Russian roulette with our lives and our livelihood. Most of us, if our companies had to shut down and lay a huge number of people off, we'd be like 30 days away from filing bankruptcy or something. That's how most people live, So this is just terribly reckless and potentially destructive. And all because, we think they're going to build, we don't know. There's no way to know what anybody's doing. We had a way before. We had inspectors in there. We were in the JCPOA. We were able to inspect, and their enrichment was only at 3.5%. It wasn't until Trump ripped up the JCPOA in 2018 that they started to enrich higher. But even then, they didn't enrich high enough for a nuclear weapon. I think they just enriched higher. This is me saying this. I think they just enriched higher to show that they could, if they wanted to try to bring America and Israel back to the table, the negotiating table, because the sanctions were hurting them. The sanctions that America had on them, the secondary and tertiary sanctions that we had on them through Europe and other parts of the world. And so, they were trying to get back to the negotiating table, and we were just making this difficult for them. All right, this next discussion is really about the blockade, and then the subsequent blockade of the blockade, and what the hell is that all about? So let's pull that in here real quick.
When Iran's got a few months left, or because you keep saying you think this is going to go on for a while, so it's kind of an open-ended question. Feel free to take it however you want.
I'm of the view that the blockade of the blockade was done, I think, to manage perceptions. What I keep hearing from very credible rumblings on the ground, credible sources on the ground, is that tactically Iran lost a lot of stuff. Strategically, Iran was winning. It's a much lower bar. They just have to survive and keep Hormuz closed. That's it. And that's what they were doing. There have been discussions, there was, 5D chess that Trump wants it closed, and that's going to choke off, Europe and UK and, China, and then they'll all come begging to us for our oil. And it's like, that theoretically makes sense, but when you look at the actual amounts involved, whether that be, what China needs, what Europe needs, etc., doesn't really make sense. It's not going to work out before the global economy collapses. I think part of what happened was, again, I began hearing that the Chinese may have recut off our exports of rare earths to us a few weeks ago. And if that's the case, war was over. It's just a question of when, because we've run down interceptor missiles so fast. We're running low, as are the Israelis, and we're running out of interceptor missiles faster than the Iranians are running out of offensive things. And so if China, and we can't make those things without Chinese rare earths. So if China tightens the exports on that, war's over. It's just, okay, we're just going to wait and see. And, do the Americans want to completely run out and make it very obvious to everyone they've run out? Or do we want to have a ceasefire and start talking? And what we've had a ceasefire and everyone started talking. And yesterday, Bessent came out, or 2 days ago, said, hey, the Chinese are not being good partners in wartime. They're choking off exports of certain goods. Is he complaining about plastic trinkets going to Walmart? Or is he complaining about rare earths again? I'd bet dollars to donuts. He, whether intentionally or unintentionally, highlighted the Chinese have recut off rare earths. And we've gotten our ceasefire talks. In that world, if I'm Trump, I think blockading the blockade makes me look less like I lost and maintains some level of strength and certainly provides some leverage relative to the U.S. the EU and UK around their energy supplies, because Chinese energy supplies have been flowing through the entire time. And apparently, tanker trackers this morning on X came out, and I retweeted it because it's interesting. 2 million VLCC tanker flowed through, that's transponder on, and it's a sanctioned tanker. The Americans didn't touch it. Why not? And where's it going? Why didn't it get interdicted? There's a lot of uncomfortable, there's a whole bunch of potential answers to that, but none of them line up really well with the mainstream narrative about what's going on here. So it's fog of war, but I ultimately think the blockade of the blockade is not the power move that some people are asserting that it is. I think it's more an optics. It's putting lipstick on a bit of a pig.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot there. The interesting thing, there was a lot of interesting things there, but, the rare earth thing is really interesting, right? So what he's saying there is we need these rare minerals from China. We basically import these rare minerals that are inputs into our missiles. When Scott Bessent, stands up and says, well, China's not being a good partner. They're not being a good global partner. Okay, well, they disagree that you should have started a war with Iran. And so they withhold something they just say, sorry, we're not selling you this. And that's not being a good partner. That's them telling you, we don't think you should have started this war. And I mean, there are 1,000 things like that. Okay. There's just 1,000 things like that. That particular thing is a choice, right, that China is making. But there are a whole bunch of other things that are just not even options. They just stop flowing. The world stops moving. And all of a sudden you wake up one day and you can't fire missiles. Can't drive your car. There's no food at the grocery store. I'm painting a pretty dim picture, but this is what's possible when you cut off such an extraordinarily important part of the world. And so let's explore that a little bit. Why is that an important part of the world? Well, first of all, oil, there's not enough oil for everybody to have what they want. Okay, and so it's just not true that the Strait of Hormuz can close and we can say to the rest of the world, come over to America. We got plenty of oil. We'll fill up your tanker. No, because we consume more than we produce in America. Okay, it's not true that we're independent or we're a net importer or whatever the propaganda is. That's not true. Without imports into America, we don't have enough oil to refine and then sell to our downstream chemical processes and things like that. So we don't have the capacity to share with the rest of the world. That waterway needs to be open, okay? That Strait of Hormuz needs to be open. That 20% of the world's oil needs to flow out of there. And China is a huge receiver of that. And so China, I forgot what percentage of their oil comes through that Strait of Hormuz, but it's a lot. And so you could have a situation where China, they're the exporter to the world, but they just start shutting down too because there's just not enough energy to run their manufacturing export business, okay? Same thing with this data center thing. We're all afraid that China's gonna, be the world leader in data centers. Look, without cheap energy, there is no data center business. These are just things that people don't think about. These are serious limitations on resources. Just because the U.S. government prints up $10 trillion or $1 trillion and says we're gonna make sure we're gonna lead the world in data center business doesn't mean it's actually gonna happen. There's a whole bunch of steel that has to be produced. There's concrete that has to be produced. There's copper that has to be produced for all the wiring and the lighting and the air conditioning and the water. You have to have water, a lot of water for the cooling, and you have to have AC, and you have to have all these are real physical things that have to be made. You can't just wish up, $1 trillion. That's why I always talk about, that's the mismatch between this fiat money system and the real things that exist in the world. There's a mismatch there. There's more money that can be produced than things can be produced. And this creates distortions in the economy and all kinds of weird incentives for people to produce things in other places. And then you wake up one day and you're like this, and you don't want to get along with the rest of the world. Like, we can either have a global economy and get along with the rest of the world, or we can kind of retreat into our continental fortress and make everything and have a lower standard of living because, it's all made by, fat, dumb, and happy Americans that aren't very productive, aren't very smart, don't know how to do things. We've lost a lot of that. And the rest of the world has not only caught up with us, but in most cases passed us. Anyway, these are just things that, the Bombs Away Club is not thinking about. They're just like, yeah, America, we can win this thing. Those Iranians, they hate us. They hate us for our freedom, and they'll just come and chop our heads off and kill us. They don't care about any of that. They don't have any, as if they don't care about raising families and living life, a fruitful life and everything. Look, those people are the same as we are. Okay, their government may be crazy. Okay, I'm not saying it's not, but we should demand that we at least exhaust all the diplomatic options that we have. And what I mean is not just run in there and start pointing it at their face and saying, you can't have any nuclear enrichment. I mean, that demand, by the way, came from Israel. That was never our demand. And the reason you know that is because the GCPOA allowed them to enrich up to 3.5% for peaceful energy purposes. But see, Israel slipped in. Israel's been kind of working in the background, slipping in these poison pills and making it part of the demands on our side. But these are unrealistic demands. They want to have a nuclear energy program so they can have power plants for the same reason we want power plants, because we like our air conditioning and we like to watch TV at night with some lights on and not eat our dinner in the dark or whatever. But, you know, these poison pills that we slip in, oh, you can't have any nuclear, no nuclear enrichment, zero. You know, these are unrealistic demands. Anyway, so this just leads, ultimately, it leads to conflict because they're unrealistic. And so that's not diplomacy. Diplomacy is recognizing that we may not like their government, but it's the government they have, and we need to work within the constraints that are created out of whatever the circumstances are. Just like Ronald Reagan worked with the Soviet Union. He didn't like the Soviet Union. The first time he and Gorbachev met, he lectured Gorbachev for like 15 minutes until finally Gorbachev said, look, we're not going to solve ideological problems here. Let's focus on, you know, the nuclear weapon problem. And then Reagan agreed. Reagan said, you're right. I'm not going to convince you of capitalism. You're not going to convince me of communism. And he said, let's talk about nuclear weapons. Well, we should be doing the same thing with Iran. We should not be telling them that they don't have the right to have a civilian nuclear energy program. Of course they have the right. The technology exists. Many countries around the world have this. And for Iran to not have it just because we say so, that's unreasonable. That's not diplomacy, okay? That's poking somebody in the eye and picking a fight, which is exactly what we did. Just like we picked a fight with Russia over Ukraine. We said, oh, Ukraine can come into NATO. No, that is a red line. That's like taking your finger and sticking it in Vladimir Putin's eye. That's not what diplomacy is. These are poison pills designed to destroy diplomacy and lead to war. And look, that's what we let Netanyahu do that to us. And shame on Trump for not being smarter about, you know, what he's dealing with in Netanyahu and being manipulated by him. And now he's backed into a corner. And the problem with being backed into a corner is it's going to be very, very difficult for Trump to have a victory out of this. Let's say, just as an example, let's say we finally sit down and do a deal, okay? And Iran gets a civilian nuclear program. We have to sign some guarantee with them that says we won't attack them anymore, okay? So now war's off the table. We have to remove all sanctions and all secondary and tertiary sanctions. In other words, sanctions that we exercise on Iran through our partners. So we have to remove all that. How does Trump come out of that looking like the great leader that he's supposed to be? The answer is he doesn't. But the problem with the escalation path is it's just like Luke Gromen said here. They just have to last. Iran just has to survive. And unless we're going to drop like 20 nukes, you know, and just destroy everybody in Iran, it's inevitable that Iran is going to win. Or maybe a better way to say it, Iran might not win, but Trump is going to lose, okay? Because ultimately, we're going to probably leave the Middle East. That's a loss for us. We're going to agree that they can have a civilian nuclear program. That's a loss for us. We're going to have to sign some sort of agreement with them that says we won't bomb them every 6 months. That's a loss for us. We're going to have to agree to remove all the sanctions, let them back into the SWIFT program, and also remove all our secondary and tertiary sanctions. That's a loss for us. When I say loss for us, it's not a loss for you and me. It's a loss for Trump. He's going to get destroyed in the media. The media is going to go, well, this is the art of the deal guy, and he just handed everything to Iran. Well, it was either that or, nuke them. I mean, that's the only way he can win. So this is just that's what I mean by he's backed into a corner, and he's not going to be able to get out unless he's prepared to kill 93 million people. And I don't think Trump's prepared to do that, but who knows? I mean, he might be. All right, let's jump into the next clip. The next clip deals with net oil export, and also just how they have us by the short hairs. I just kind of talked about that, but we can hear Luke Gromen's version of that feeling about have them have us by the short hairs. All right.
But right now, the U.S. is actually a net importer of crude. It's a net exporter if you include crude and all like refined petroleum products. But strictly speaking, in terms of some of it's like we send stuff to Canada to get bitumen and back. But this idea that right now they could just flip a switch and the U.S. could just send barrels of crude and replace what's going on over there is crazy. That just the numbers don't work.
No, and that's exactly right. There's a logistical issue there that is number one. That doesn't make sense. But then again, if you just raise a point of are we going to go to the brink of war with China, right? China cuts off pharmaceutical ingredients to the U.S. in response. Like one of my best relationships in China. He's American. He's been there 30 years, brilliant, and he's been very steadfast since Trump got back into office, and still is saying this. The Chinese haven't even started playing hardball yet. They haven't even started, right? So take away pharmaceutical ingredients. How many millions of Americans are dead in 6 months when their drugs don't come? That's these are the things that we hear sort of these, the MAGA influencers like,
hey, but it would fix the Social Security problem.
Oh boy, you're going to go there, huh? Yikes.
Okay. Well, so on this, this leads into, we can move on to other things here that are also disturbing. By the way, I should probably mention, Luke, just for everyone to know, we're recording this on April 15th, so I don't know exactly when this is going to drop, but in terms of, there's a lot of current events, things are fluid, so if in case it looks like we're ignoring something obvious, it might be because you're hearing this after we recorded. You had a provocative phrase. You said that China has us by the short hairs. Can you explain, and you and I both have similar hairstyles, so that's relevant to us. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Before we get into that, I want to kind of just expound again. There are things that we don't know that we don't even know. Okay, let me just cover that for a second. There are things, that we know, right? I know how to do some engineering. I know certain things about economics. I know some things about sales because I'm in the sales business. And then there's things that I don't know. Like I know that I don't know. Like I know that I don't know how to do brain surgery. I know that I don't know how to survive in the woods, for example. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that I know that I don't know. But these are relatively small circles in the overall knowledge picture. If you think of it like just all knowledge, right? A bigger portion is what you don't know that you don't know. And that's where most Americans are, okay? I mean, even me, there are so many things that I don't even know that I don't know, okay? And, you can almost just envision Trump, somebody trying to explain this to Trump and going, we'll just make a deal. It won't be a problem. And, and things aren't a problem until they're a problem. That's kind of how things work in politics. Well, we had all these unintended consequences. Yeah, but to me, that just demonstrates that the government is into too many things. It has way too much power. If the government runs around all the time talking about unintended consequences, well, then you're over your skis. You're way out over your skis, and you don't even know what you don't know. And I think that's the realm we're in. We're in this realm. I think there are some people that are telling Trump, hey, we need to wrap this up. But Trump is desperately trying to wrap it up, but there's just no path for him to win. That's the real problem. And so he's going to ultimately he's either got to escalate this, and that just leads to a trap. Okay, this escalation path becomes a trap, just like Iraq was. Okay, or he's just got to be prepared to literally kill everybody in Iran. I mean, everybody, just like we did to Japan. And I just don't see. I don't see Trump taking a win at all, unless he did something like that. And then you could argue that neither one of those is a win. If he nuked everybody in Iran, well, now America's going to be a global pariah. That means now that's only one country has ever launched a nuclear weapon on other countries, and that's America. And we did it twice. Okay, can you imagine the optics of that? Or the other scenario is we do a deal and Iran gets to enrich uranium to civil levels. They get a security guarantee from us. The sanctions are lifted, and maybe the Strait of Hormuz is controlled by them, and they get to charge tolls in order to pay for all the damage that America and Israel's done. That's a bad look for Trump. Is his ego so big that he just can't look at that and he's got to hit the button and launch a nuclear weapon? I don't know, man. But the options are very, very limited, is the way I see it here. The best thing is to just have never started it. But that train has left the station. So I don't know what they're going to do here. I just don't see a path for him to negotiate this away unless we take a strategic loss. Oh, and by the way, one of their conditions is America leaves the Middle East. Okay? That is a huge law. I mean, can you imagine? That's going to be, it may be decades before another Republican president gets elected, just because that would be such a huge loss in the eyes of the political connected class. So, yeah. But yeah, the whole pharmaceutical thing, again, this comes under the category of we don't know what we don't know. Most people don't know that all these pharmaceutical ingredients come from China. They just cut them off, and next thing you know, people start dying of heart attacks. And, let's face it, we're not the most healthy nation in the world. There's got to be some truth to the fact that these drugs, these pharmaceutical drugs, are keeping some people alive. So you could, if they cut it off, that could be the end, A bunch of people start dying. I don't know. Interesting way to look at things. None of it's good. That's just why I say you just don't start these things. You just don't do it. Go do the diplomacy route, like legitimately and honestly and authentically pursue diplomacy. And don't let someone like Netanyahu. Netanyahu's like how you ever seen the little devil sits on the shoulder? Got the devil and the angel. Netanyahu is like the devil whispering in Trump's ear. And oddly enough, Thomas Massie is like the angel whispering in his ear. And he's trying to push Thomas Massie out of office and won't listen to him and keeps listening to Netanyahu. And it's just leading him in a bad direction. All right, let's continue here.
Yeah, it is ultimately, they've boxed us in a lot of different ways, right? They've got us on rare earths. They've got us on electrical equipment. They've got us on, when we spend the structure of the system that we've allowed to evolve has been based on a fundamental misapprehension of economics in the long run. And this ties into the Austrian, I think it ties into the Austrian school pretty well, which is, the Chimerica, Bretton Woods to whatever you want to call it system. Well, all right, China goes into WTO. We send our factories and jobs to China. China makes stuff. They send it to us. We send them dollars to pay for it. They take the dollars. They recycle them into our capital markets. Capital markets go up. People make more money and financial conditions loosen. They borrow more money, buy more stuff from China. Wash, rinse, repeat. It's a virtuous cycle. And it all worked great until 2008 when we blew up and the Chinese are holding all of our assets, all these bonds. And for 40 years, when a crisis such as the one that hit America in '08 hit anywhere else, whether that be Southeast Asia in the late 1990s, whether that be Latin America in the early 90s and the 80s, whether that be Russia in the late 90s, everywhere else, the recipe from the Americans via the IMF and the World Bank was always the same. Austerity, cut government spending, break up your oligopolies, break up your big banks, devalue your currency, and change your political structure. Change your politicians that led you here. And what did the Americans do when it was their turn in this banking machine? They're like, we're America. Our currency, your problem. Well, we're just going to print the money, and we're not going to change a thing. So China, sorry, we're just going to devalue your bonds. Russia, we're going to devalue your bonds. Europe, we're going to devalue your bonds. But we're not going to do anything. We're not going to restructure a thing. And that was seen as a financial attack in Beijing and in Moscow and elsewhere. And those are not my words. Those are the words of former CIA operative in 2014.
Okay. Yeah, I love this. I love this way he's talking about it. When it was our turn to get in the spanking machine, there was no austerity, there was no get rid of your political class. All the negative prescription that we dealt out to the rest of the world. I mean, I don't know if you remember in Greece, they had a sovereign crisis and people were going to the ATMs and it was only letting them get 80 euros a day and things like that. Some of you don't remember all that. The lost decade in China or in Japan, this all happened when the Nikkei topped and collapsed. There was just all this austerity, right? It's okay, America, it's your turn to get in the spanking machine. Your financial system ran amok and you nearly cratered the entire global economy. And we just said, we're not getting in the spanking machine. Thank you. And instead, we're fighting these wars, we're fighting in the Middle East, we're overthrowing countries and sowing the seeds of chaos. And what you're going to hear him say is, China, what they did is they said, okay, instead of buying bonds, we're just going to take dollars and we're going to go buy stuff. We're going to go invest in things that shore up our economy for our people. I'll just let him tell it because it's what they did. And I want to come back and talk about that again because even though they did it legitimately, we still have a problem with it, right? So let's play that.
So, right, Luke, just to make sure people are, so you're saying like the rounds of QE, for example, it wasn't just Glenn Beck and me that was freaking out, that people in Beijing were
absolutely. No, the CIA, the U.S. former CIA, senior level guys have been in there for 25 years going, Beijing is pissed. And so the thing about China is Americans want China. They put their own views of how they would act on China, but that's not how the Chinese react. The Chinese are very passive aggressive and patient. So Chinese waited until the crisis ended, and then they said, all right, we're done buying your bonds in 2013, late 2013. They phrased it nicer. They're going to say, hey, we're not buying more treasuries. They said it's no longer in Chinese interest to grow FX reserves anymore. It's like, we're done buying treasuries. And they began, instead of recycling dollars into treasuries, they started buying copper mines, nickel mines, Port of Piraeus, other ports around the world, invested in the Panama Canal. They started putting these dollars into hard assets. Because they saw that as the real value. And by virtue of not just that, but then in 2015, they came out and said, we're also, in addition to buying up all the stuff, we're also going to invest in China 2025. We want to dominate in these industries of the future in 10 years. And at the time, most Americans, and certainly American investors, like, we're powerful. They're not idiots. Well, by 2021, people are like, whoa, they've done it. They're being very competitive. And so now there's really only a few high-end industries where they are not dominant, semiconductors, few other things. And so by virtue of this long run investment in dominance, including subsidies, look, people are like, they subsidize their industry. Of course they do. They don't play fair. Of course not. But my whole ongoing point for this last 15 years is like, they're subsidizing their industry. We subsidize our industry. We subsidized our bond market in 08, right, with QE. We subsidized wars of choice in the Middle East to the tune of 8 to 10, $12 trillion, to spent what, $5 trillion in Afghanistan or $3 trillion in Afghanistan, being there for 20 years to take Afghanistan from the Taliban and then give it back to the Taliban. Like that is literally like, they should have just handed out like coke and hookers to like the entire country, lit the money on fire. It would have at least been a fun party for America as opposed to what we did in Afghanistan. That's how much we wasted the money. And so while we were wasting tens of trillions of dollars.
By the way, it's worse than that. Like we invaded Afghanistan to take the country away from the Taliban. Not only did the Taliban take it back over, but essentially, well, I'm thinking of Syria. In Syria, there's the leader in Syria is actually Al Qaeda. So these were the enemies. Taliban and Al Qaeda were the reason we got into these conflicts in the first place. And now the Taliban, we took, just like he said, we took Afghanistan away from the Taliban, and then when we left, it went back to the Taliban. So we accomplished nothing, okay? And in Syria, we overthrew Assad, where he was protecting Christians and people we like there, and we turned it over to the Taliban so they could run around and chop people's heads off. It's insane. It's insane that we envisioned, I don't know, that they were going to have some democracy over there, and we were just arrogant. We were arrogant. We lacked humility. We didn't want to deal with the way the world is, deal with the way the world actually is, and not wish it to be something else or try to make it in your own image. It's almost like the way the Democrats treat Americans, the Democratic Party primarily, but, they believe in the infinite journey of perfection of human beings. And it's like, no, we just want to be free. Leave us alone. Quit trying to improve us for our own good, I mean, there's, these cultures and stuff exist, and we just need to deal with people the way they are and quit trying to force people to live the way we live or to live some other way or whatever. There's just a lack of humility in our foreign policy. And look, it's driven by our politics, but it's also driven by the people. The people in our country, half of them which are Democrats, they lack this humility. And so they're like, yeah, bum them, they're too comfortable with this level of force. And it's just not the way, you live together. I mean, I have a lady across the street from me. She's an older lady, and we don't have the same politics, but I'm not over there trying to beat her into thinking the way I think. I mean, we can still live together. It doesn't make sense that we're just using this military. It's like a hammer looking for a nail, always. The military is this blunt instrument, and then the fact that we have this really powerful military with all this technological capability, we just run around going, America, we're the awesomest of the awesome. We're the greatest. We have the most powerful military in the world. And it's like, okay, but you don't lead with that. You lead with diplomacy. You lead with an understanding that these people that you may not get along with in the world, they also have a right to exist, just like we have a right to exist. You can't just sit there and go, assert that they're a certain way and therefore we need to wipe them out before they wipe us out or whatever. That's just paranoia, and it's just not the way human beings get along. Anyway, I'm kind of lecturing, which I don't want to do here, but I think there's an underlying problem in our culture that we feel like it's okay just to jump right to force every time and just realize that there's a cost to that. And he's going to talk about that cost right now.
On this stuff, the Chinese were investing in infrastructure and setting up to dominate industries. And so that brings us to today of why do they have us by the short hairs? Because they were patient, and I wouldn't say they invested everything smart, but the bar is just so low. They invested, they didn't go to war in stupid wars of choice where they literally got nothing out of it and completely wasted the money. They've got cities and rails and factories, and they own mine, right? So now we're into this situation where the US has to either completely blow up the rules-based global order, right? Because now China took American dollars and said, we're going to buy a stake in the Panama Canal. Fair and square. That's the rules-based global order. They had the dollars the reserve currency. It's accepted everywhere. They made the investments there. They put the cranes up, the made in China, blah, blah, blah. And then the Americans are like, no, that's not the rules. Like, wait, you use dollars, right? So they now have us in this position where, if they want to go to the Port of Piraeus, if they want to go to Africa and start seizing copper mines or whatever they go down to Venezuela. Chinese made a whole bunch of investments in Venezuela, fair and square, with dollars. Americans went down and said, no. That's why they have us by the short hairs, which is America has to blow up the rules-based global order. They have to discredit it by their actions, which they're doing, in order to basically undo the folly of the last 20 to 25 years, which is we don't need to produce stuff. We can just print dollars. We can just focus on paper financial assets. But the problem is you can't fight wars with paper assets. You are not a sovereign country if you don't make your own defense base.
Okay. This is the point I'm always trying to make, is it's not just the money, okay? It's the stuff. The stuff is important. The stuff that we need to survive, to make our lives work, that we consume, but also the stuff that the government consumes. We talked about these missiles and how we're not going to be able to build any more of these missiles if we don't have these rare earth materials from China. I think what's happened is this global reserve currency has tricked everybody into thinking it's just a money thing. Just decide how much money you want to spend on something and print it up. But there are real limits. Okay, there's real scarcity in the world. We don't have the lithium mines, and I don't know what all these rare earth materials are, but we don't have them over here. They just don't exist in North America, not in the same quantities that they have over there. And so, in order to get access to these materials, we're going to have to either invade these countries like they did in the old days. Like if a king had a whole bunch of gold, okay, and he was a wealthy country, the Mongols would come over and invade and steal everything, take the spoils. But to his point, the rules-based global order is based on property rights. It's based on your stuff is your stuff and my stuff is my stuff. And if we want to trade, I can buy it from you and you can transfer those things to me. And so this is what China's been doing. China's been, here's some money, Panama. We would like to take a stake in the Panama Canal. Okay. Panama did it. And then we ran down there and said, no. You can't have the Panama Canal. This is in our sphere of influence. Or they go and buy a copper mine. And what he's saying is we could go down there and we could send the military and seize copper mines and take it back. But we set up this system, which advantages us, by the way, because our dollars, we can just print them up. So the money, you could print up, it's like the minimum wage argument. Somebody says, we need to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. And they want to raise it to $20 or $30 or whatever. And just to prove that it's not money, it's not the money, okay, I'll say something like, why don't we raise it to $100 an hour? I mean, if $30 an hour would help poor people, think how much more it would help poor people to have $100 an hour. And then you'll have people go, and they'll start backing up. But they can't explain to you why that's not a good idea. And so the economy, I know everybody knows this, but it's very complicated, okay? If you could just sprinkle more money on top of it and everybody was wealthier, don't you think we would have already figured that out? Don't you think our politicians would already be doing that? They're trying to do that. Okay, that's the point. They're trying to do that. They're saying, well, we have the world's global currency, and so I'll just print up a bunch of money and I'll go, that's what deficit spending is, essentially. I'll send more money to favored political groups or whatever they feel like is a good return on that money for the government. But it doesn't help you and me. And even sprinkling money into the population doesn't help you and me, because what ends up happening is whatever's produced now is just produced at a little bit higher price. So we end up giving it back on the things we buy. That's what inflation is. So these are just truths that are, that exist in spite of what our attempts to evade these truths. All right, one of the things I have, and I'm just going to pull it up right now, is we were talking about, Lynn Alden was talking about this upside down pyramid kind of concept, and we were talking about how production expands. And so I have a graphic on the screen here, and what this graphic is showing is that your oil, your helium, your rare minerals, commodity chemicals, these are inputs into the global economy, and they come in at the top. But as these inputs are divided up and bought and sold and distributed throughout the economy, and they end up in these different, as you make your way down to the consumer, notice the base gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so over on the left-hand side, it talks about, hey, a 1x kind of impact at the very top can have like an 81x impact at the bottom. And this is kind of what we're setting ourselves up for. We're cutting these global commodities and chemicals off from us, off from the global supply chain. And this lack of these chemicals is going to replicate down through this structure of production until it gets to the consumer. Now, some things like gasoline, we're already seeing, right? Oil becomes tight. Well, that immediately impacts gasoline because gasoline is directly made from oil. But not everything is like that. A lot of things go through multiple layers of additional supply chains and distribution and buying and selling and things like that. Oil basically goes to a refinery, and a refinery makes gasoline. So it's a very shallow, almost a one-to-one relationship. Whereas, your consumer products go through, multiple layers, distribution and retail, and then you've got different production layers and things like that. And so there's a lot more areas where that's replicated. And so I just thought this was a good graphic to kind of demonstrate the problem. I would have made it even more triangular, to basically demonstrate how much more this relationship, expands as you go through the chain of production. And this is what I think a lot of Americans are not prepared for. They're like, yeah, let's go bomb Iran, and Trump should do 5D chess negotiation and just do the art of the deal or whatever and get us out of this thing. No, what he should have done is just never started it in the first place. He should have never listened to Netanyahu, and we should have tried diplomacy, real diplomacy, not, hey, you can't have food, or something ridiculous, a poison pill that just destroys our ability to, effectively carry out diplomatic activity. That's essentially what Netanyahu's involvement has done to the United States. And the sooner Donald Trump can out Netanyahu as the part of the problem, what he ought to do is just come on TV and say, look, I made a huge mistake. This Israel alliance has really cost us in ways that are very difficult for me to even explain at this point. But I move that the Congress immediately defund what we're giving to Israel. And I move also to have the World Court prosecute Benjamin Netanyahu. And then try to deflect all this off onto him and then go to the Iranians and negotiate. That's what he ought to do. But the negotiation, whatever deal we come up with, it's going to be worse than what we started with. That's my feeling. All right, everybody, I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the show. Thank you guys for coming in. Thanks for listening. I don't think I can put that picture in the show notes page. I'll put it somewhere. I don't know. I'll figure out some way to put it where you can get it. But right now, I'm not sure how to do that. So, but thanks for coming in. Thanks for listening. Share the show. Maybe this is a good show to share. I don't know. I'll try to do a couple more shows a week than I'm doing right now, and get back in the habit. But man, I just had too much going on and wasn't able to get in there and make too many shows. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, end the show. Thank you guys for coming in. Thanks for listening. If you get a chance, go to YouTube and watch, and then subscribe and like the show there. That'll help the algorithm do its job. And but keep listening and come back in a few days, and we'll have another episode for you on Who Gets to Decide. All right, everybody. Peace.